thanks once more for coming this evening. Outsider art or work made by self-taught artists or vernacular art often comes from a place that results from some kind of disengagement, whether it's from society or circumstance. And many of us know firsthand how art making can be a useful tool to help us reconcile conflicting messages life might give us about who or what is important in society. I think it's appropriate then that William Hawkins and Hawkins Bolden made art out of the things in their everyday. It helped them to re-engage with the world. The tire scraps, the plywood and masonite, pots, pans, buckets, scraps, rags, house paint. As human beings, we sort of absorb ourselves with the accumulation of information and evidence. It's part of our desire to create knowledge and our compulsion to leave behind traces that we were here, that we lived, and that we meant something. This, along with our ability to make distinctions among our different kinds of labor, labor that produces goods, or labor that makes works of art, is part of what makes us human. It's with this in mind that I want to introduce our distinguished panel to you. They'll present a number of perspectives tonight on Black vernacular art, and I'm looking forward to a really robust and interesting discussion that will complicate some definitions about high and low art, and offer some new ideas and perspectives about our creaturely impulses that compel us to make artwork. To my left is Fo Wilson. She is currently an assistant professor at Columbia College Chicago and previously taught at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Rhode Island School of Design, the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, as well as the California College of Art, formerly CCAC, and Parsons School of Design. She graduated with an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design's Furniture Design program with a concentration in art history, theory, and criticism. She writes and lectures about art, design, and craft to international audiences. Her furniture-based work is exhibited nationally, and her design work is included in the collection of the Cooper Hewitt National Museum of Design. After Fo, we will hear from Krista Franklin, who is a Chicago-based poet and visual artist, originally from Dayton, Ohio. Her poetry and mixed media collages have been published in lifestyle and literary journals such as Coon Business, Copper Nickel, Rattle, Indiana Review, Ecotone, Clam, and Calavoon, and in the anthologies Encyclopedia Volume 2, F through K, and Gathering Ground. Her visual art has been featured on the covers of award-winning books and exhibited nationally in solo and group exhibitions. Franklin is a Cave Khanum Fellow, a co-founder of Second Sun Salon, a community meeting space for writers, visual and performance artists, musicians, and scholars, and a teaching artist for young Chicago authors, Neighborhood Writing Alliance, among others. And we'll close the panel discussions with Hamza Walker, who is sitting in the middle. He's the Director of Education and Associate Curator for the Renaissance Society at the University of Chicago. Walker currently is on the boards of Noon, a literary annual publishing short fiction, and Lampo, a new and experimental music presenter. In addition, he has served on numerous panels locally and internationally, and is the recipient of the 1999 Norton Curatorial Grant and the 2004 Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement. In 2010, he won the Ordway Prize for recognition of his contribution to contemporary art. And with that, we will hear our first presentation from Phil Wilson.
Okay. Hey everybody.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good.
Good that you all came out. So I have a bunch of slides and a bunch of terms that ask questions, and they're just going to run behind me. They're not in any particular order. They don't speak to any particular judgment about anything, but they'll just be running behind me as I talk about a few things I want to bring up for the discussion. So the slideshow presents some images of various artists. They're classified in various ways, and it tries to note some questions around these ideas of terms with how we classify vernacular art making. And I want to say that I first became aware of Hawkins Bolden at the Kohler Center for Art in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. Some of you have been there. It's just a wonderful place. And they had this show called American Story a couple of years ago, which they included his work in. And what I really love about the Kohler is when they present work, they often ignore classification and they put work together depending on themes. So in this American Story, they were showing artwork of American makers, and they were different makers that you might traditionally classify in contemporary art and vernacular art, naive art, or whatever, but they ignored those things and they put all of these different artists together to tell a complete picture of an American story, which I really appreciated. So I want to interject 2 points in our discussion that we're going to have tonight. One, I want to argue against the premise that Black vernacular art comes out of this idea of having little or making do. While it is true that a lot of us, particularly African American people and people of color, have to make do, that on the other side of that, we have a very, very rich culture to draw from in terms of our DNA, in terms of the African continuities that we still express on a daily basis, that still persist, and other rich, invented, and original African American creative, spiritual, and material culture. So I want to kind of argue against kind of this idea that it's coming out of this sense of poverty, because I actually see it coming out of a place that's very, very rich. And the second point I'd like to interject into the discussion is that this urge to make is universal, and it's not really owned by any particular community. Everybody has the urge to make. Even those of us that don't consider ourselves artists, we get up, we dress, we decide what we're going to wear. That's a creative act, how we set the table. So this idea of outsider art, I think we can certainly question as outside to who or what, right? And I think we could probably, all of us can come up with an answer for that. But when we think of and apply the term outside of art making, it's easy enough to see other creative genres, such as, why wouldn't hip hop be considered outsider art? It's outside, although it has entered the mainstream musical community, it certainly started as an, quote, outsider art, or we can consider it. Why couldn't beat poetry? Why couldn't breakdancing be considered a folk art? So I think these terms can be very, very fluid. Margaret Rowell, who was a former curator at MoMA and the Pompidou Center in France, in the catalog, 2002 catalog of the exhibition American Vernacular, questions many of these terms that we throw around to classify our art outside the mainstream. Vernacular art, folk art, outsider art, self-taught art, naive art, tramp art. She asks why, quote, is there this such a great divide between the official art world, culture, and an artistic vernacular, end quote. And she talks about that in these categories, that there's little chronological narrative, there's little defined geography about where this comes from, there's little in terms of socio-cultural framework, little in the way of a studied aesthetic value system to situate them for serious study in the canon of American art that isn't inherently marginalized. That if there was more of a serious study, there would be more of a chronological narrative, defined geography, more of a socio-cultural, defined, specified, and articulated framework. So Rowell contends that the greater art world situates these makers as autistic. So what she means is not autistic as opposed in reference to like a mental condition, but autistic in its location outside of the social norm. And so she feels that this greater art world situates these makers as autistic, and that metaphorically they're these outsiders on the fringe of society, kind of antisocial, whether by choice or by not. So the question we might ask is, are they there because they want to be, or because we've not made a place for them to be otherwise? The answer could be a little of both. I think about in my own practice as a maker, and I use this term maker, and so many times when I'm asked to speak or I have to send in a bio, they'll always change it to artist. And I'm always like, why did I do that? Maker. I feel like I'm a maker. And there's this problem with classification, right? And I think it's going to be, as we evolve, as art practices evolve more and more into the 21st century, I think this problem of classification is going to be more of a problem as time goes on. I'm trained as a furniture maker. I make furniture and domestic objects that I put in exhibitions, sometimes in a museum, sometimes in a particular public place, sometimes in a gallery. Sometimes that museum is a craft museum, sometimes it's a contemporary art museum. What does that make my work? Contemporary art, craft. So the term maker for me helps me define kind of what I do. I make objects, but I also make meaning. So that feels very, very complete. In closing, I just want to say I was asking a collector friend of mine who collects, quote, outsider art, why she collects this art and why she's attracted to it. And she was telling me the story of the first time she saw this work was the James Hampton piece, the big,
The throne.
the big throne, and she was just blown, freaking away by that someone mind could produce this work. And she also was telling me that she thought it was authentic, beautiful.
Here we
and
go.
That's it.
Behind you.
Oh, I love your time. She also said that she thought it was authentic, or the category is authentic, beautiful, and uncomplicated. And although some of those words are problematic in how we might define authenticity, it could instigate a whole nother discussion. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as that and let my other panelists get in on it. Thank you.
So I'm kind of approaching this from a space of being both visual artist as well as poet. So, you know, when I think about the concept of vernacular or the word vernacular, my imagination immediately goes to Black language, dialects, Creole, patois, pidgin, code, the people, the streets. Black vernacular in visual culture is ultimately another means of communication that I like to refer to as visual poetry. Would you turn this slide to for me? So I have a couple of different images here that are kind of just be reflection, ultimately, for what I'll be talking about. I'm going to do this. Okay. Like spoken and written language, Black vernacular art is telling us something. It's signifying, it's relaying codes, it's telling stories. There also exists this notion of the ordinary to the extraordinary, that the everyday object, person, event can be elevated to art or be attributed with a kind of sacredness. In Hawkins Bolden's case, the black bottom pots and pans become material for sculptural exercise. Punched out holes become faces. Burnt bottoms become texture and skin. The objects, pots and pans, rubber soles of shoes, old bike tires and water hoses, in the hands of Hawkins Bolden are transformed. Tubing becomes arms and armature. Discarded wood becomes spine, foundation, and figure is born. Narrative plays a major role in the Black vernacular. Telling the stories of the people, the community, even your own story is a vital part. Bolden Hawkins' pots and pans of faces carry a series of stories in and on them. Families and communities may have eaten from these objects, and people were fed from them. Their utilitarian histories are inscribed on their surfaces. In the paintings, collages, and drawings of Hawkins Williams, he is relaying both autobiography and communal biography. The Pen, 150 Years of Crime, 5 Horses, The Last Supper, in which he imposes not only his own smiling face, but also brings mysterious black folks to the table with Jesus. They become disciples. Hawkins Williams also inscribes his name boldly on everything he makes. His signature is frame and foundation. His birth date, his very existence is kind of woven into the work. He is witness and record keeper of his history and the stories of his communities. Hawkins Williams and I share geographical location. As a native Ohioan, I'm deeply in touch with the landscape and what I call the dream space of Ohio. The slowness of Ohio, the time that one has to think, to dream, to imagine and envision is abundant. So when you're not working at a job, what do you do with your time? In Ohio, you watch TV, you hang with friends, you drink. And if you are creative, you make. You write, you create. The act of making is labor. You are working, you are productive, and you are producing. If you have no one who has ever taken you to an art supply store, which is very likely, then you use what's around you to produce. You use what is abundant and available. You use the house paint that you or your cousin or brother or uncle or father used to paint Big Mama's or baby girl's bedroom. You take the masonite board that you found leaning against the neighbor's trash bin and use it as a canvas. Wherever there is material. This is the way that many people, not just peoples of the African diaspora, have lived and created for centuries. You live off of the land in every way, and art making is a part of that living. When I first came into the exhibition space of Hawkins, one saw everything, one saw nothing. I was at first mystified by the work, then I became angry, then delighted. I had to sit in the gallery space to contemplate and to stare at the work for its simplicity to become beauty for me. And that is the genius to me of these two artists, that the work is revelatory. That at first you see pots and pans and tubing, and then if you spend enough time with the work, you see bodies, you see cocked heads smiling at you. At first you see broad strokes and bright color, and then you see death and liberation. You see nature in harmony and at war. You see 150 years of prison industrial complex bathed in white, and you may be enlightened, and you may be transformed. I was called to this table because I am largely known in certain communities to be a Black vernacular poet, performer, and visual artist. Up until two and a half years ago, I was self-taught and self-trained writer and mixed medium collage artist. I am currently in my last year of grad school at Columbia College Chicago with a discipline in interdisciplinary arts, book, and paper. Even inside of the institution, I carry with me the Black vernacular, what I call working in the tradition. And the narratives of my community and myself remain the conceptual arc of my work. I recognize what is abundant in my community landscape. For example, what I have come to call tumbleweaves, and I make art from that abundance. In the tradition of the Black vernacular, my current work explores the fantastical narratives of my people, the spiritual, the magical or mystical, and the terrible. I infuse fragments of the female body, the Black female body, through hair weave, in handmade paper, and I call the whole affair the 2013 Narratives of Naima Brown. Like Hawkins and Hawkins, it is work that speaks to and about Black life, and uses material that is in and of the landscape to tell the tales.
Computer switcheroo. Got that. Thank you, Leanne. You're doubling as Vanna White. I don't know who that makes me. Does that make me Regis? Is that who Regis started? No. Who was Vanna's
Pat.
host? Pat Sajak. There we go. That makes Pat. Okay. This should work. Now I understand. Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. Okay. one. It's always like magic every time. So just a very short slide presentation. This is just to start with Alfred Barr, one of Alfred Barr's notorious diagrams. Alfred Barr was the founder of the Museum of Modern Art built in 1929. And as you can see in the center, I'm going to do this right here, right? He had a very judicious, let's say, pluralist understanding of the roots of modernism, right? Very, very heterogeneous understanding, which of course included Negro sculpture, right? Now we can also say that those were views that the trustees at that time didn't necessarily share, but Barr, being quite strong-headed, was able, and I think throughout his tenureship, again, a very heterogeneous series of exhibitions, which would include the first African-American artist to be shown at the Museum of Modern Art, which was William Edmondson in 1937, right? Quite tellingly, and for those of you who don't know, William Edmondson was born in 1872 or 74. The exact date of his birth is debated. He died in 1951. He didn't start making work until 1931, after he lost his job as a janitor, and he had a calling from God, who told him to start making sculptures. And my favorite quote from him about beginning was, "And they had better be in limestone too." That God was very specific. I don't want you to carve wood. They better be in limestone. Okay. So he picked up a hammer and a railroad spike, and he started by carving tombstones. And that's Edmondson is Tennessee. I can't remember where the town in Tennessee. Tellingly, for me, 1937, that Barr would choose Edmondson over a figure like Aaron Douglas, right? So he's operating in the 30s, still, I would just say, the latter day phase of the Harlem Renaissance, right? That Barr would choose Edmondson as a representative of modernity over and above a figure like Aaron Douglas, right? With his own flat planes of Afrofuturism is quite telling. And that's to say, I think that the Black vernacular has been an inextricable part of modernism writ large, and I think that was the beauty of what both like these categories are completely open, even though we still, when and where do we deploy them? Is for the sake of convenience, in certain circumstances. You could hang these things alongside anybody working in the field of assemblage, in a way, right? But I picked William Edmondson's exhibition, and these are more Aaron Douglas works, right, who you would think would be Barr's choice in some sense. Right. And interestingly enough, the photographs of Edmondson were taken by Edward Weston and Louisa Dahl Wolfe. Right? Louisa Dahl Wolfe worked for Bazaar magazine. She was a fashion photographer. She was very instrumental in kind of jump-starting Edmondson's career. And then later, figures such as Edward Weston came down and also photographed him. Barr became interested in the work, his narrative. Now, by the time of his death, Edmondson was pretty much forgotten about, even though folk art remained something of a staple on MoMA's radar in terms of mounting a series of folk art exhibitions perennially over the course of the next several decades, all the way up to Marguerite Rowell's American Vernacular show, right? And I know she would have been looking back to Barr's 1938 American folk art show. Now Barr, at the time, even Abby Rockefeller, who was the seminal patron of the Museum of Modern Art, was a very big American folk art collector. So you could argue that folk art and those kinds of vernaculars have always been part of modernism at that level. But particularly, I would say, because of Cubism and the colonization of African art on behalf of the European moderns, right, that Barr would have a particular interest in a Black vernacular. Right, seeing in fact its link to African traditions, right? So I think that he very astutely complicates matters. Right? So these are just images of some of Edmondson's work, right? So he starts. So it's only he starts the last 20 years of his life that he's making work And he produced upwards, there are extent of some around 300 Edmondson works out there in the world. Not too many. Right, and obviously the number of biblical figures, angels, animals, people, bird bath. This one knocks me out, puts me on my ass, just because it looks, I don't, Etruscan, I don't know, something older than, something from the Stone Age, right? But just still carving that little indentation in the brick to make it like an ice bag, like a dodo bird with a hangover. Okay, so just to move on, John Outerbridge, just wanted to talk about the use of discarded materials, found art, objet trouvé, as a staple of a Black vernacular, to the extent that I would say that there's really the boundary between high and low within African American art. It's almost impossible to really talk about a figure like John Outerbridge and his use of found objects. So the Black vernacular is a part of a high art discourse with respect to African American artists in an indisputable fashion, right? And I would say that figures like John Outerbridge would know that they were, to the extent that whether or not you wanted to say is he drawing from a Rauschenberg assemblage tradition, or is he drawing from a Black vernacular tradition, Outerbridge would see no difference at all between those things. And I would say that Barr, again, as a precursor to making that narrative, erasing that line from the top, would make that very clear. But I would say that those links often aren't made, in fact. These are just pieces by Outerbridge. And they're from throughout his career, these later pieces. This is a recent piece, he just did this in either 2010, 2011, The Rag Room, and this is at LAX Art in Los Angeles. I don't know why this Magician Dollar thing is coming up. Wait. I don't know what this is. Go away. Whoa. I think this is called And Now We Break Bread, or Let Us Break Bread. This piece is a classic Outerbridge piece. Betty Saar. So this is a 2010 show of Betty Saar's at Michael Rosenblum in New York. The Cage, the new works of the Cage series. So I would say that. No, this is an earlier piece, but it's still in the 2000s by Betty Saar. It wasn't in that show. Right, so Outerbridge and Betty Saar are sort of, senior figures, and I would say establishing something of what's called a Black aesthetic, but insofar as a Black aesthetic rests on an assemblage practice that I would say has something to do with the use of discarded materials and then transforming those things into dignified works of art, as part of the narrative, right? David Hammond's, right? This piece is called Red Hood, right? Let's say this is a piece from Hammond's 93, 94. Right? This is an amazing piece by David Hammond, right? Who I would say, on the one hand, both operates in that tradition, but he slides more towards a Duchampian trajectory or tradition of wholesale appropriation, right? So that you could talk about this either these Buddhas are not objet trouvé, obviously, and there's a nylon string between the two of them, and in the very center, you can barely see it, there's a safety pin. And so the name of the piece is Praying for Safety, and it's a classic David Hammond piece. And you would never see two praying figures facing one another. as far as the positioning of Buddha statuary. Spade with chains from Hammonds. And this is a beautiful 80s assemblage work from David Hammonds. I want to talk more about, actually, just in closing, that advanced without me, this chair by Rodney McMillian, which I think is Rodney is a younger artist. Rodney was born in 69, 70. He's a couple years younger than me. Thinking about David Hammonds and his relationship to Outer Bridge, Betty Saar, and coming out of a black assemblage tradition, right? But I would say Hammonds, his ability to simply appropriate objects wholesale is very, very important in distinguishing himself from that tradition in part. And then a latter-day figure like Rodney McMillian, who here wholesale appropriates just a busted up chair, gut bucket funky, from around the way, right? Into the gallery, right? Where you could just talk about that move being a wholesale appropriation in a manner similar to Duchamp's. Just to return to this idea of black vernacular come face to face again squarely with what are no doubt modernist traditions, right, in a way. And what I like about McMillian's move with this chair is it isn't at all the idea of transforming those everyday materials into a work of beauty. His is instead, what you see is what you see. It was fucked up over there, it's fucked up in here, right? So if you want to talk about that, it's like, this is a synecdoche for that, right? Poverty, right, in a way. And so I like this idea that he's in fact kind of going against the grain while at the same time, understanding that tradition of a black aesthetic and kind of, resisting it all the more to in fact further. Now I like what Fo was saying in terms of where is this line between black vernacular and popular culture, right? So I can't help but think of, and my son's advancing without thinking about, and this is to say, black artists are always in a position of working dialectically, right? So the relationship between high and low is much more porous. So, a series of artists, why is this going forward? I want to pause, stay there. This is Virginia Nemarco, and the name of this piece is Nubian Queen, where she approached, sorry, it's advancing, I'm telling you to do so. She approached 13 artists. She's Nigerian, living in London. She approached 13 artists around Leicester Square who do the charcoal portraits, those very idealized portraits. Approached 13 different artists who all did portraits of her, right? So the whole piece is called Nubian Queen. And just the range of idealizations, right? So the one on the lower left where she looks like Marcel Marceau, the one on the right here where it was clearly done by an Asian artist, right? With these Asian features. But again, she's drawing on, I would say, a tradition and a streak of black romanticism in art, right? So the use of popular culture, right, to which I would say folk art in part belongs, is again part of this dialectic where black artists who are considered working in a high art or fine art tradition are still always in dialogue with the vernacular, right? Be it folk or be it popular forms of culture. So that last image, this is Mickalene Thomas, and I just wanted to do that another image of her appropriating, what is it, clearly a 1970s interior. We got Thelma Houston and Diana Ross situating this model here with the fro, with a history of, sort of divas, leopard skin, the full patterning. But just again, going back to a period of, a latter-day civil rights, black nationalist era in terms of this aesthetic, which is a moment of black cultural self-determination, right? So to then appropriate those codes and signals, and what Mickalene is working now, as a very particular moment in culture, where a black vernacular, I would say, as popular culture, reached a particular peak in terms of style, right? The search for a unique black expression during those, let's say between 63 and 73, right? Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, right? Is interesting, just as a younger generation reaching back to that period, right, and appropriating it, even if for the services of a sort of, in a certain sense, camp, and so forth. So that's it. Thank you. Back to you, Leanne. Vanna. Tell our audience what they will win this evening for sludging through the rain. What do we have for them? iPad 5?
We have our sincere thanks. Thanks to all of you. Really interesting fodder for a conversation, I think. I think everyone sort of touched on issues in relation to what do we mean when we talk about culture, what do we mean when we talk about Black culture, questions about being an insider and an outsider, and where that circle is, or maybe that line between all those things. Bo, you had a question, you made a comment in your presentation that I think might be a really good place for us to start or reflect in our conversation. You mentioned that, in terms of outsider art, naive art, self-taught artists, all these different terms we have for people that sort of make work outside of the fine art market system. Are they there because they want to be, or because we haven't given them space to be in that circle or otherwise? And I wonder, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, and if you do have
Sure. I think, certainly some artists that we might consider outsider artists, I think may choose or be very comfortable kind of making in that outside space without the pressures of what being in the mainstream means and what you have to do to be able to function successfully in the mainstream. But I also want our categorization of these artists. Are they out of the mainstream because we haven't made a place, or we've explicitly, as you were talking about how Barr actually did include in his thinking what that was, but there are a lot of institutions that
Right, it just fell off over time.
It fell off.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that Edmondson didn't come back in until 1980 with the Corcoran, Black folk art is really what it re-announced.
Right.
His presence.
Right. Looks like some of our audience wants to get into.
Many of these people whose work we're looking at never thought of themselves as artists. I mean, they were compelled to create for whatever reason, whether the Lord was speaking to them or whatever, but they didn't think that they were going to join the art market.
And Hawkins Bolden was making scarecrows to keep
Yes,
the birds
absolutely.
from his garden. So it was a totally, he, in his mind, he wasn't making art. It's those of us who come after it and look at it and put it in a white box and label it as art based on our aesthetics and understanding of the process. It was interesting to me that you showed, Hamza showed, many of the artists you showed near the end of your presentation were trained artists, and we didn't talk about vernacular in terms of, I mean, to me, when I think I'm the exhibits chair at Intuit, so, we show this work and all work by untrained artists, and yet then we see the work by some of the artists that you showed who are obviously trained artists, using these same kinds of materials, putting them together in very similar ways, and being looked at through a whole different prism than the work is looked at when it's shown in this gallery.
I think that speaks to the point I was telling you that, as someone that uses furniture, that sometimes the same work can be showed in a craft museum or in a contemporary museum. And it's looked at and thought of differently in each of those places, in each of those contexts.
I like that you're using the word craft.
Thank you. You know, it's a word that
I like
somehow
make.
it has
And
gotten
make is
out of
good.
favor. I mean, the Museum of Art and Design dropped craft. I used to teach at California College of Arts
Right.
and Crafts. Now it's just California College of Art. But I think they missed the boat because when I look at what's going on in the marketplace, I see the same thing with outsider vernacular being brought into contemporary practice or quote trained practice. I see craft value systems coming into advertising, or even Linux programmers have craft values in terms of the community that they operate in and being able to share information in open source systems. To me, that's the apprentice system that used to be where people shared their knowledge as opposed to coveting it.
I think of a lot of the trained artists, you know, as something, you know, African American artists is something of a portal, like, and it's a funny word to use, but they, as far as establishing some kind of equilibrium or some kind of semi-permeable membrane inside the museum that, you know, you can't possibly, like, to look at Outer Bridge, and again, those assemblages, you can reference the Rauschenberg next door or wherever, you know, they are in the museum, or you can go to outside the museum, but I still think it's like, but Outer Bridge is definitely understands, I would say, himself as, like, I might be trained, but this comes from a tradition, right? Yeah, and there's no way so my appreciation and understanding, not that it's necessarily through Outer Bridge per se, but I like that idea of, like, he is someone who definitely says, well, if you have this, well, then you can certainly have that, you know? So, and even if they don't, I mean, it's very telling. The Museum of Modern Art does not own William Hawkins. That, to me, is really quirky. They own, and I mean, the reason they own Bill Trailers is also kind of...
Or darker.
Well,
Yeah,
they own
yeah.
Pippin.
Yeah, how they get them, you know,
Right.
and acquire them, whether through gifts or through kind of
Gifts.
acquisitions, is also very, very telling, you know. Even though they don't, and I like the fact that, you know, on the one hand, I could be, you know, shocked and outraged that MoMA, they should own it, and if only for the purposes that that's part of their legacy. It's like, they started this, you know, in a way. But at the same time, I don't mind, because I don't think Edmondson is fine without, you know, it's not like, in a way, he doesn't need MoMA to validate him in a way, you know, his stature is, you know. And in fact, I actually prefer it being outside, you know, in a way, knowing that it's like, no, cultural production is what it is. The museum is not necessarily the end-all and be-all, it's the mediator or judge of what, you know, what goes on.
It seems like more and more that membrane that you speak of is becoming more and more porous. Things are going out, things are coming in, and a lot more that didn't used to get in terms of popular culture, vernacular culture. It's starting to get in, and, you know, I wonder if some of it has to do with this stuff, the technology stuff, the access we have to information and things and people's opinions. We can get them. I wonder if that's being those boundaries between accessing information around the world, because that boundary is starting to break down, is that having repercussions and breaking down other boundaries. So those membranes are becoming more and more porous. Things are getting in there, you know. Just a question.
I mean, I think one of the more telling, I mean, it's just the, with respect to black artists, is that, you know, African American art has been a bull market for the last 30 years, going strong, and is more and more with the success of, stars, Caroline Carey and David Hammond. But I think that there are now just like Henry Louis Gates, right? It just takes one, to suddenly spawn an industry of Black literary scholarship that did not exist before. To say it came into being, to go to the seminary co-op bookstore, I remember when I started at the USC in 1984, it's like, okay, there was like a shelf for saying, now there's like a whole little room, and it's to see that come into being, but say, well, what about the art historical scholarship? So to watch that slowly begin in a way and to grow. So when Kelly Jones did Now Dig This with that show, but I think that stuff is actually work that had been marginalized, from the 60s, 70s. Now, Melvin Edwards, it's like museums are starting to acquire that work, quietly.
Thank God.
Yeah. So I feel like that which is a different narrative about how that, but along with it, I would say, because of the relationship between Outer Bridge and folk artists, that also has ramifications for the folk artists, right? So all this stuff is being brought in wholesale into museums more so now than it would have been before.
I think that, how do you feel about some of the stars like Oprah and Bill Cosby who are collecting art and specifically Black art, but are not including the outsider artists?
That's really telling, the ones who do and the ones who
It's fascinating.
Yeah, and
they have consultants who are building those collections.
Right. And that's a whole,
It's another.
Yeah, right. With, it's their disposition as to where they want to go, and just knowing it's like Bill Cosby turning Oprah on to Shaker Furniture, and Oprah single-handedly driving Shaker Furniture into this stratosphere, where she could, had it been William Edmondson, same thing would happen.
But unfortunately, being a furniture maker, I know that there's a Black Shaker tradition that perhaps they don't know about, but there is, and maybe through their collecting they'll discover it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'd like to know about that.
Yeah, there is.
The face jugs that the Milwaukee Museum just had an exhibit that just came down. That was fascinating to me, that we think of those jugs as being a tradition, a Southern tradition, but not necessarily connected to the Black population. But I think these were all, as makers, but I think these were all made by slaves. Was that, I didn't get to see the show, I just have the catalog.
I saw the show, having lived in Milwaukee for 4 years before I came here. And what's interesting about that show is that there's scholars that can easily make connections to African traditions in terms of funerary art. And a lot of the Southern scholars that collect that kind of are pushing up against that and trying to say, no, this was, it doesn't quite fit into the romantic narrative of the slave and being able to come here and be introduced to some European tradition. It's like, no, they brought that with them. And they made that, and that's part of an African tradition that, bumps up against European traditions and then gets hybridized. Just knowing the Chipstone and just being able to talk with them about how this came about, knowing that they were bumping up against some of those Southern scholars who did not want to acknowledge that perhaps some of those fake jugs come from a tradition that came with them and didn't just start here in the United States.
Well, that's the same way with the yard art, isn't it? I mean, we also haven't mentioned yet that sort of the Southern African yard installations that have been quite prevalent.
Bottle trees come from Central African funerary tradition.
Are any of you familiar with Randall Morris's blog about Black vernacular art? Well, you should be on that.
I want to pull Krista back into this conversation since we were talking about culture and its relationship to what is made and that collision and dialectical course, middle spaces between high and low. You said you mentioned that you share some geography with William Hawkins, and so you sort of found a resonance with the work that was made, and you're also a poet. And you mentioned you talk about when you think of vernacular, you immediately think about language. Can you speak about some of the things that go on in your long work?
Yeah, I mean, for me, well, and a lot of it's already been touched on, when we talk about being in the tradition, and we talk about pulling from cultural sources, but also familial in some ways, and also African that sometimes we don't even recognize are African, street culture, hip hop, all of that kind of infuses inside of my work. And so for me, especially particularly with my poetry, it's the language. I use street language a lot of times in my poetry. It's a fusion or a collision kind of between the idea, I guess, of the King's English, right, and street language. So I think that my work kind of plays within those levels. Kind of. Especially being in school now, having not been educated in art prior to this experience as graduate school, it's been a very, very interesting experience.
I think in one of the, there's a bit of the documentary about William Hawkins. When we think about outsider art, some of those definitions are, not having been touched by the culture,
Right.
and a particular kind of culture,
Right.
like that. Do you feel like there are any new complications or tensions now that you've sort of been on both sides, like as someone?
Oh, a lot. Absolutely. I mean, I'm constantly at war with myself, with other people. Even if it's a silent war, definitely, this kind of grading between what's valuable as a human being, for me, what's kind of what I call just my base level of etiquette, politeness, the ways in which people are treated, the ways in which work is received, right, and kind of an attention that's paid to making, right. I struggle with that inside of this kind of art world environment. Sometimes it grates against the regular girl in me. The ordinary girl who was just making collages on her bed. You know what I mean? In a very, just in a very practical way, and some of it was very functional at first. I kind of brought the collages into, I had been always making the work, but I brought it into the public eye in order to make money, right? So there was always this kind of exchange thing that was happening with me and art, and then it got accelerated. Once I got into art school, it's like, oh, value systems and, who's important and who's not important and, what's valid and what's not valid, that became very complicated for me. And it still is. And hopefully will always be, because I kind of find it a little bit repulsive. Just a little bit.
Yeah. Yes, that is true. William Hawkins knew about the art world and its systems in schools and museums, and maybe he could have gone on to do that, but made a choice to
Right.
sort of remain outside.
Right. Right.
So, I think if we have some other questions from anyone in the audience, we can take those as well. Yes.
Hi, I have a question. I want to know what each of the panelists think about the idea of intuitive, like this place, institutions, museums, centers. Do you think that helps or hinders the definition of the intuitive artist? Like, does it mean since it's here, it doesn't need to live somewhere else, like it has its own place, like Black art shown in Black History Month, like that's where it lives. Can it, do these institutions help or hinder that idea of that kind of artist?
I think they're actually really great. I would make a distinction between the role of culturally specific museums in relationship, where like, African American museum, Jewish museum, right? Which is the old, and the big house, as to who does what, rights, roles, responsibilities, who's talking to who, and the growth and expansion of, and it's hard for me to gauge because Chicago, from the second I got here, folk art was not, I didn't, and it's such a part of Chicago's DNA, right? So collectors, it's like from the images, and surrealism, so it's like you can't, it has equal footing and equal billing. So for me, but then I feel like it's like, wow, and then suddenly it's like, wow, oh, New York, wow, they're really crazy over Henry Darger. It's like, my God, like, I've been looking at Henry Darger. I don't want to see another Henry Darger. I'm not interested in Henry Darger. And that's when Henry Darger takes off. So I feel like it's like, wow, the rise and sudden vogue of folk art. I'd always thought well, it's big in Chicago, I assume it's as big everywhere else, and not realizing that it is. But institutions that are really devoted to giving those figures their due as individuals. Whereas before, in doing the scholarship and research that's necessary, and having shows like this one, because they aren't being done at the Art Institute, which is not at all a condemnation of the Art Institute, but they can only do so much. But I just think that there's room for more, right? But I just think in terms of things like in Milwaukee, I want to know, did they produce a catalog for the Face Junk show? So I think that they, despite any kind of claims to like keep it outside the mainstream or to perpetuate an idea of its separation and segregation, there are way too many. Every time I come in here outside a magazine, I'm afraid to even pick it up because I look at it and I'm just like, who are these? I didn't know any of these artists. It's like, my God, this guy's playing Battle Caps Downwind. And it's its own universe and world. But it's like somebody is giving that stuff its due and dignity in doing these shows. Is what's important.
I would say I just want to see it everywhere. I want this place to be here, but I also want to see the work in other places too. So I want all of it. I'm just greedy. I want it all.
Well, we always say if we accomplished our mission, we wouldn't have any need to exist. Which is if we're successful in promoting the work by these self-taught artists to the degree that they are treated equally with the other artists, then there would be no reason for an Intuit to be here. But
it's starting to happen. The Art Institute had a show of James Castle's just a year ago. And
But even if it became more mainstream, I still want you to be
oh,
here.
great.
We want
Thank you.
Those artists, I still want you to, then you can even do a different job in terms of how you present those artists, because you'd be free to not feel the obligation, we gotta get this person, this person, this person. You'd have some more freedom.
Exactly, right. So even what would it mean for the DuSable to take this show, right? The whole same thing, but in another way not, right? Different audience, but it'd be the same kind of thing, but it's like, well, don't worry about it. There's more. Just go on and do another show.
I don't think it really, I think regardless the work is going to be made. You know what I mean? Whether it's inside of institutions or whether it stays on the fringe. You know what I mean? Like when you're talking about intuitive art, there's always going to be makers.
Right.
There's always going to be makers, whether or not they're going to be here or in another space or on the street or, it's always going to be.
But that makes me think about it in a historical way, right? Because when I think about a lot of the figures, like a back catalog of practitioners from, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, who have yet, I'm going to say this word, but you guys know what I mean, who've yet to be discovered, right, in a way, that are out there. But at the same time, I'd also want to say, traditions, in some sense, changing. Like, what is that relationship between, for some reason, this isn't to ghettoize things in a weird way, but a folk art and the rural, right, that doesn't, and now it's like, and that's always been the case, right, that the moment that it is feared that rural traditions will cease, is usually the moment that the ethnographers bust out that tape recorder, right? Go off into those mountains, sing a song. It's like, take photographs of all this stuff, right, and document it, because they understand it's like, urbanization, industrialization is now killing off a particular way or mode or something. But on the one hand, to then say, well, I don't want to necessarily freeze it as a specimen, and admit that it's like, well, it's going to change and permutations to it, and now it lives as an urban phenomenon, perhaps. But just thinking about that idea about its marginalization as it relates to a particular historical window, when I think about outsider art, in some way. That's just an open-ended thought about that relationship.
Be a really great challenge for a curator to take that term and turn it around. That could be an interesting show.
Yeah, what's funny that the necessity of those terms, though. I mean, it's like I've stopped feeling uncomfortable with them, and I know they're all probably outside, inside. Or I just like, it's like, you know what? That's a great Bill Trail drawing. I don't. It's either good or it's bad, or it's like I like the one pot that's hanging there with the one thing, more than I like the one on the right. It's like, and I just don't. It can hold its own against a Katie Nolan or a Melvin Edwards, and it's fine. At least I feel as though I've gotten to a stage professionally where, if I get caught up on those terms, they're just, yes, I recognize they've ceased to be productive, but they're fine as a matter of convenience. I still will abide by them.
Do we have another question
With the magazine that you were mentioning and the ever-growing popularity in some sense, has the number of artists and the expansion of this, when you were speaking on the magazine, has it shifted your perspective? This is for all panelists on some of the work that you find. How you were speaking knocks you off your ass in some ways. Does it shift your perspective in some ways with the number of introductions of new expansion? I don't know if I'm
Like
asking
new
the question.
artists?
The fact that it's more of a proliferation of
With this large
outsider
magazine,
artists?
yeah. I'm asking, does
Does
it
it shift?
does it have you look at the previous work a little bit differently, or is it?
Not for me. I can't speak for everybody else, but I feel like that work's always been there. It's just perhaps being recognized and seen by more people, but that work and the idiom in which it's made of has always been there forever. So it's great that more people are aware of it, but if it's changed my perspective about the work, I mean, I think that what Hamza was saying, it's always nice to find new artists, no matter what category, that you can be excited about. Every time I find someone I haven't known before, I don't care what category they're in, if I'm excited about the work, I just love it when I have a new person to, be texting about or whatever. Say, hey, did you see that? Something. I'm just excited because I love art and I love making and I love seeing new, exciting work. So it doesn't matter where it comes from, to me.
Yeah, and it can shift, but I think what you were saying, like, yeah, that's the same thing. And then when it's really, really good, like not just like, oh yeah, that's really great work. There are things that, just as a teacher, right, that forced me, it's like, oh my God, this person was doing this. It's like, oh, this is like in 1942, like, I can't believe that they made, even if it's a single piece, like that, then I have to reconcile, like, this production with like somebody who's contemporary, right? So it just forces me to completely always like be revising my little canon, and even my little hit list of personal favorites and who I can fold in. But when you find like those, and to slow down enough to like really look at work, through publications where you can see lots of images of things and find pieces, that really do force you to reassess, right, why so much value being given to this? When somebody did this in 1942, it's the same thing, in a lot of ways. So then you realize like, ain't nothing but the frame. This one's just being framed and discussed in a certain way as opposed to this one. Which is always like, some of the more profound moments to realize that's like all kind of a fiction.
Yeah, I think on that note, I think, you talked about texting, about your latest new find, technology you mentioned before as well. I think that changes how we interact with the work and how we're able to contextualize these artists. So maybe, that new person that you discovered and putting them in your canon next to someone else, and then what does that mean for this canon or these people or whoever else comes down the pipe next because somebody Googled something or discovered an old text or something somewhere. Do you have any more questions?
Or comments?
Yeah, or comments.
I was wondering if Krista would mind sharing a piece of poetry.
I didn't bring any with
You
me
didn't bring
tonight,
any?
strangely enough.
Wasn't it freestyle?
Bust it out. We know you got some.
I am the purist. I'm kind of a purist when it comes to it, actually. I'm very wed to the paper, So I'm sorry I didn't bring anything. I didn't even think anybody would even ask. Even though I said poet like 25 times.
Right.
Yeah, it never even dawned on me.
Well, your reading was the same. It was like, wait, is she gonna break out like for a presentation?
It's a big
All
headache.
poetry. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
It's
Well,
funny.
so what did you guys think of the show? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, are these mainly your students, or are a lot of you
No,
Some,
I
students?
only know
some
two
are from my
people here.
class.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I'd like to know what they think of the show.
Come on, guys.
I mean, you were saying you saw a lot of faces. My favorite part about it is like they lose the whole making becomes like a fetish activity over and above. Like at one point, I wanted to like turn them into that, and then they just it's like, no man, this is much more like just a buckshot.
Right.
Like even if it is a, 2 trash can lids or something that resembles like
Yeah.
I know.
anthropomorphized, scarecrow form.
Right.
The holes were much more, and that's a hole.
How about those trousers, stuffed trousers?
Oh yeah.
I mean, I also think though it's what you bring to it, right? What's already in your mind, right? And what is when you look at something, what does your brain start to make? How does it make sense of this? What you're looking at, so the idea that you saw buckshot, which is excellent, right? And then I look at it and I'm sitting there staring at it and I see, this cock's head smiling at me all of a sudden, right? So it's almost like, what do you bring to the viewing, right? As
Yeah,
you,
because
what do
I
you bring
see
to it?
abstract form. I don't see figurative
Yeah,
Right.
faces at all.
Exactly.
So I look at it totally differently.
It's a
Right.
strange way to make, because I think about like, fetish activity, like, like placing nails, but I don't think of the fetish as making holes, like making holes. I mean, things have holes drilled in them, and dots and circles, but his are specifically like holes.
Well, the thing I kept thinking was, this is a man who went blind, and the hole is the eye.
Right.
So he keeps
Right.
making, to me, he keeps making eyes and
Right.
everything.
Right.
To his artwork sees from you.
Right.
That's, my
Right,
thing
that's
that I
your
bring
own
on it.
Tactile.
Yeah, the tactile nature.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah,
The
there has
tactile nature.
to be some,
There's-
I love what you said about being a maker, that you're making about making meaning. And the way I see it, there was a woman over there saying, what about what's going to happen with intuitive art? I think, like Krista said, it's going to go on and on and on, because just because you bring something inside of MoMA MoMA doesn't teach people to see. We should always be inculcating, teaching people to see, and I think that's what the intuitive artist is doing. I feel like a lot of the discussion about, is it this, is it that, it's something for the trained artist that's seen both of them to go back and say, hey, I think, it would be more meaningful to art as a whole for you to incorporate this, because making those kind of correlations just makes more view, So that's kind of what I thought.
What do you guys think about these terms, or do you approach the art as if it is outside of something, or how do you look at it?
I think for me, I've never taken an art class, so it can be a bit intimidating when you're looking at a lot of different things. Like she was saying, I don't have a trained eye, so I bring my experiences to whatever it is that I see. So I saw a lot of different things just in the slides that were going past. But I guess is all art subjective? Is it what am I supposed to get out of that? You know, what did the maker, what did the maker intend? I guess would be my question or my confusion sometimes.
You know, I just saw the new Jimmy Roberts show at the NCA, and what I loved about what he and the collaboration between the curator did, there are no tags, there are no names, and so it allows space for you as a viewer to not be told what to think about the art. You get to just approach it however you are and take whatever you want to from it. And I just think that's a pretty bold move, and I really appreciate it.
And people get it. I toured children through that space.
I took
you
my
know?
students too.
Yeah, and they
Yeah.
get it. They're like right away they understand exactly what's happening without the text, without any of the labels, but they walk in and they're like innocence, you know, newness, this white page, anxiety, you know, like they're picking up on these really lofty concepts, you know, in very simple pieces. So
Yes, yes,
it's a beautiful show.
yes.
Great.
Well, I just hope that those of you who are here for the first time are interested enough to come back, because we have ongoing programs that are pretty exciting.
And just to blow our horn a little more, in January, we will have an artist in residence, Kevin Sampson, who's a New York African-American self-taught artist, does a lot of street art around. He'll be working in our gallery for 2 weeks, building and creating. We're going to have an open gallery, an opening where the gallery's pretty empty except for all of his materials piled in the middle, and then he'll be working. You can come and go, maybe even help out. 2 weeks later, then we'll have the opening with the finished, this finished sculptural project, and it's based on politics and the history of African Americans in this country and slavery and all sorts of things. So I encourage you all to come back in January when we have him working here in the space.
That sounds great.
Thank you, panelists, and thank all of you for being part of our conversation.
Thank you.